I've got this sort of a tool closet that I've made a lot of different brackets for to hold different tools, and I still have quite a bit of square feet left. And I needed another row of holders for router bits with half-inch shafts, so I'm going to just spend a second here putting together another rack to hold another 7 router bits and add it to the page, you could say, of my folding tool rack in the router bit section. And it just goes one more row above those on that big blank page. Stay tuned. My router bit collection keeps increasing, and I find I'm buying more half-inch shaft router bits to fit a larger router, and so I'm going to just build another one of these racks and glue it to the wall here to add to this collection. Each of these tips forward just a little bit to make the router bit a little more visible and a little more accessible. So here I'm measuring what that angle is on my other ones because it's been so long since I built one, I don't remember how I did it. So I'm just using this angle gauge to get the tipped forward angle of this piece of walnut. And then I take that gauge over to my table saw to tilt the blade to match that angle because I want these on my rack to all look identical as if they were all put up at the same time. So I just hold that gauge up against the saw blade and tip it over, and I think it ended up at some random number like 11 degrees. I think I've got a picture coming here of my tilt gauge, and I think it's something around 11 degrees. Yeah, that's not important. What's important is that I think that they tip forward a little bit. So I measured the depth of the top of that little rack, and it measured at about 1.75 inches. So I just adjusted my blade here to cut through this half-inch thick walnut. I made a mark on it for the width at 1.75 inches and ran it through the blade, again with the blade tilted at 11 degrees. And that gives me my top piece of the little rack. I just simply buzz this through the saw at 11-degree tilt. So that's the top. And it leaves behind a piece that's also got an 11-degree tilt. If you put that one on the back wall and flip the other one around and set it on top, you get a nicely matched set holding that top piece at 11 degrees and giving you a lot more glue surface to apply this rack to the wall. The bottom edges of those racks were about 1 inch tall, so I ripped that remaining piece down to about 1 inch, again maintaining that 11-degree angled edge. And because this walnut is, it's a long story where I got all this half-inch walnut, but it's pre-finished. And because of that, glue doesn't want to stick to it so well. So I find myself having to, on a cut edge, I have no problem, but I find myself having to rough up the surface a little bit to get glue to stick. And you'll see that in a moment. So now I'm measuring to find the center because I think I've found that 7 bits across is about all you want to fit on one of these, because if they get too close together, they're hard to grab with your fingers. So I'm just measuring the center, and all these ended up at about 1.25 inch spacing from each other. So I made some lines on there at 1.25 inch spacing. Use my square to just bring those lines forward so I could find some centers to use my Forstner bit on. Readjusted my square to halfway across for depth. Use that again for marking, and I've got little X marks the spot for my Forstner bit. I'm using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit for the 1/2 inch diameter shaft router bits, and I'm going to stop my drill press with that bit maybe just about 1/8, maybe 3/16 off the bottom of that board. So I get a little well to slide the bits down into. So once I've adjusted my depth stop on the drill press, then I was able to just carefully line those up at each of those X's and drive that bit down as far as the stop will allow. It gives me a nice level bottom for all 7 holes. End up being identical. They're in a straight line. They're at a uniform depth, and they fit the 1/2-inch shafted router bits nice and tight, so they hold the bits upright and not floppy when I'm opening and closing those doors. Everything stays put on the wall. As I've designed and built all of these different tool racks, I've always had that in mind, that they had to be able to be wiggled around a little bit without having tools falling off the wall. So once I drill these out, these 7 holes, all I do now is bring these 2 pieces of wood together, and I used a CA glue because it dried nice and fast. And before I did that, I softened the edges. All of these previous ones I'd done, I chamfered the edges just a tiny bit with a low angle block plane. So I just take just a few passes to give those edges a little bit of a chamfer, because this wood is so hard and it's cut so square. They're kind of uncomfortable with their square edges, so I just give it just a little softness by running a little chamfer along that front edge. Also took a chamfer along the bottom front edge of the upright piece. Just a few passes just to soften it. I also then took a second to get a little bit of dark walnut stain to darken that cut edge, because again, this wood is pre-finished, and so when you cut it, you can see a little bit of a color difference. A small minor detail. It's just a tool rack, but I wanted them all to look uniform. So once I'd done that, I put a little CA glue on and hold these 2 pieces together for just 30 seconds or so. And I found that they were very solidly put together. I just used the tabletop to hold them flush with each other and apply a little bit of pressure, trying to be careful not to get it on my fingers, which I've done plenty of times in the past. And again, the CA glue dries so fast. I just leveled it out, applied pressure with my hands, made just some final light tweaks to it to get it lined up so it had a very flat back, since the back of this 2-piece item has to be glued to the folding panels of my tool cabinet. And the reason I'm gluing them is that I didn't want holes drilled in the cabinet that you'd see from the back side, since you're always seeing both sides of each of those leaves or pages in my tool closet. So I've found that glue works fine if you just find a way to clamp them in place and let them dry overnight. I've never had one drop off, so I think it has worked out fine through the years. I think I applied just another little bead across this seam, allowing that glue to soak in a little bit, just to make sure this thing stayed together. Once I'd done that, again, because they had a cut edge, I just got a little bit of dark walnut stain and just very quickly wiped it on that cut edge so that all of the surfaces that show sort of matched. Again, once it's up there on the wall, half of them are covered in dust as it is already. It's not hugely important, but I thought it only took a second to add a little color, and it makes for a better looking rack in the long run. Once I got it on the wall, I roughed also that piece of plywood because it has a finish on it as well. So I roughed that up with a little bit of 80 grit paper, made some marks to get the spacing right so these would all be uniform, and then I clamped a piece of wood to the face of the panel, my tool panel, and then slid the shelf in behind it. I found that it was just a little bit loose and it wouldn't press the shelf against the wall, so I took out trusty old business cards, which work perfectly as shims, and jammed business cards in there until I got a tight fit. Put some glue on it, let it sit overnight. The next day, I was able to come, remove the business cards, remove the goofy clamp that I had holding it to the wall, and I had a finished product of another tier on my router bit panel of my tool closet. Here I'm just removing the clamps that were holding that piece of wood up, and here's the final product. A little bit of water on a terry cloth towel. I was able to rub a little bit of the remnants of the glue off, that some squeeze out that occurred. And once I'd done that, I stuck some newer router bits in it, and I've got room now for another 7, 8, 9, 10 router bits as the collection grows. This panel still has a ton of room on it, so I'll be able to grow my collection for quite some time and probably add something else to this panel as well. So here it is, the final product. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.